The years 1915 and 1918 were pivotal years of World War I, but these were also the years of our main characters were born. Julius Rosenberg was born May 12, 1918, in New York City to a family of Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire. The family had moved to the Lower East Side by the time Julius was 11. His parents worked in the shops of the Lower East Side as Julius attended Stewart Park High School. During the Great Depression, he became a leader in the Young Communist League USA while at City College of New York. In 1939, he graduated with a degree in electrical engineering. On September 28, 1915, Ethel Greenglass was born into a Jewish family in Manhattan. She had a brother, David Greenglass. She was originally an aspiring actress and singer, but she eventually took a secretarial job at a shipping company. She became involved in labor disputes and joined the Young Communist League, where she met Julius in 1936. They would later marry in 1939. Here's the timeline of events. We're going to start all the way back in 1944. Rosenberg had been introduced to Smirnov by Bernard Sucher, a high-ranking member of the Communist Party USA and NKVD liaison for Earl Bauer. Smirnov was recalled to Moscow in 1944. His duties had taken over by Fleskov. In February 1944, Rosenberg had succeeded in recruiting a second source of Manhattan Project information, engineer Russell McNutt, who worked on designs for the plants at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. For Rosenberg's success in recruiting, he received a $100 bonus. McNutt's employment had provided access to secrets about processes for manufacturing weapons, weapon-grade uranium. He said that Julius had passed secrets and thus linked him to the Soviet contract agent, Anatoly Yakovlev. This connection would be necessary as evidence if there were to be a conviction for espionage of the Rosenbergs. In 1955, the U.S. government made public many documents decoded by the Vienna Project showing Julius Rosenberg's role as part of a productive ring of spies. In August 1944, David Greenglass began to work as a machinist on a Manhattan project in New Mexico. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, vice chairman of the Senate Select Committee of Intelligence, investigated how much the Soviet spy ring helped the USSR to build its bomb. Moynihan, in 1945, physicist Hans Bethe estimated that the Soviets would build its bomb within 5 years. According to Greenglass's testimony at trial, Julius engages in espionage activities. In particular, according to Greenglass, at the Rosenberg's New York apartment in September, he presented sketches and notes about the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project to Julius. The notes are typed. Senator Joseph McCarthy is elected to the U.S. Senate. He aggressively seeks to identify and punish suspected communist and Soviet spies. On August 29, the U.S. did not share information with nor seek assistance from the Soviet Union regarding the Manhattan Project. The West was shocked by the speed with which the Soviets were able to stage Joe-1, its first nuclear test. However, Leverty Bera, the head official of the Soviet nuclear project, used foreign intelligence only as a third-party check rather than giving it directly to the design teams, whom he did not clear to know. Considering that the pace of the Soviet program was set primarily by the amount of uranium that it could procure, it is difficult for scholars to judge accurately how much time was saved, if any. In January 1950, the U.S. discovered that Klaus Fuchs, a German refugee and theoretical physicist working for the British mission in the Manhattan Project, had given key documents to the Soviets throughout the war. On February 8, 1950, 20 senior government officials met secretly to discuss the Rosenberg case. Gordon Dean, who was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, said, "It looks as though Rosenberg is the kingpin of a very large ring, and if there is any way of breaking him by having the shadow of death penalty over him, we want to do it." Mays Land, a member of the prosecution team, said that the case against Ethel was, quote-unquote, not too strong, but that it was, quote, very important that she be convicted too, and even given a stiff sentence, end quote. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover wrote that, quote, proceeding against the wife will serve as a lever, end quote, to make Julius talk. 10 days before the start of the trial against Ethel was resolved, when David and Ruth Greenglass were interviewed a second time, they were persuaded to change their original stories. David originally had said that he had passed the atomic data that he had collected to Julius on a New York street corner. After being interviewed the second time, he said that he had given this information to Julius in the living room of the Rosenberg's New York apartment. At Julius' request, Ethel had taken his notes and, quote-unquote, typed them up. In Ruth's second interview, she had expanded on her husband's version. Julius then took the information into the bathroom and read it, and when he came out, he called Ethel and told her she had to type this information immediately. Ethel then sat down at the typewriter, which she had placed on a bridge table in the living room, and proceeded to type the information that David had given Julius. As a result of the new testimony, all the charges against Ruth were dropped. Fuchs identified his courier as American Harry Gold, who was arrested on May 23, 1950. On June 15th, David Greenglass was arrested by the FBI for espionage and soon confessed to having passed secret information onto the USSR through Gold. He also claimed that Julius Rosenberg had convinced David's wife, Ruth, to recruit him while visiting in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1944. He said Julius had passed secrets, thus linked him to the Soviet contract agent Anatoly Yakovlev. On June 16th, David Greenglass was arrested and confessed to his involvement in the spy ring. Julius was arrested the next day on suspicion of espionage, based on David Greenglass's confession. On August 11th, Ethel was arrested after testifying before a grand jury. For all questions, she asserted her right not to answer. The Fifth Amendment. FBI agents took her into custody as she left the courthouse. Her attorney asked the U.S. Commissioner to parole her in his custody over the weekend so that she could make arrangements for 2 young children, but the request was denied. Julius and Ethel were put under pressure to incriminate others involved in the spy ring. Neither offered any further information. Another conspirator, Martin Sobel, fled with his family to Mexico City after Greenglass was arrested. They took assumed names, and he tried to figure out a way to reach Europe without a passport. Abandoning that effort, he ended up returning to Mexico City. He claimed that he was kidnapped by members of the Mexican secret police and driven to the U.S. border, where he was arrested by U.S. forces. On August 16th, the U.S. government claimed Sobel was arrested by the Mexican police for bank robbery, and he was extradited the next day to the United States in Laredo, Texas. On August 17th, the grand jury returned on indictment, alleging 11 overt acts. Both Julius and Ethel Rosenberg indicted, as were David Greenglass and Yakovlev. On March 6, 1951, the trial of the Rosenbergs and Sobel on federal espionage charges in the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of New York had begun. Judge Irvine Kaufman presided over the trial with Assistant U.S. Attorney Ivan Sapol leading the prosecution and criminal defense lawyer Emanuel Block representing the Rosenbergs. The prosecution's primary witness said that he turned over to Julius a sketch of the cross-section of the implosion-type atomic bomb. This was the Fat Man bomb dropped on Nagasaki, Japan, as opposed to the bomb with the quote-unquote gun method triggering device used in the Little Boy bomb dropped on Hiroshima. On March 29, the Rosenbergs were convicted of espionage. They were sentenced to death on April 5th under Section 2 of the Espionage Act of 1917, which provides that anyone convicted of transmitting or attempting to transmit to a foreign government, quote, information relating to the national defense, end quote, may be imprisoned for life or put to death. Prosecutor Roy Cohn later claimed that his influence led to both Kaufman and Sapol being appointed to the Rosenberg case, and that Kaufman imposed the death penalty based on Cohn's personal recommendation. Cohn would go on later to work for Senator Joseph McCarthy, appointed by Chief Counsel to the Investigations Subcommittee during McCarthy's tenure as chairman of the Senate Government Operations Committee. In opposing the death penalty, Kaufman had observed that he held the Rosenbergs responsible not only for espionage, but for the American deaths in the Korean War. Quote, I believe your conduct in putting into the hands of the Russian the A-bomb years before our best scientists predicted Russia would perfect the bomb has already caused, in my opinion, the communist aggression in Korea with the resultant casualties exceeding 50,000, and who knows but the millions more of innocent people may pay the price of your treason. Indeed, by your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. End quote. The U.S. government had offered to spare the lives of both Julius and Ethel if Julius provided the names of other spies, and they admitted to their guilt. The Rosenbergs made a public statement, quote, by asking us to repudiate the truth of our innocence, the government admits its own doubts concerning our guilt. We will not be coerced, even under pain of death, to bear false witness. End quote. In May, Pablo Picasso wrote for the communist French newspaper La Humanité, quote, the hours count, the minutes count. Do not let this crime against humanity take place, end quote. The All-Black Labor Union International Longshoremen's Association Local 968 stopped working for a day in protest. Cinema artists such as Fritz Lang registered their protest. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, supported by public opinion and the media at home, ignored the overseas demands. In November and December 1952, the defense of the Rosenbergs surged and was organized by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, confirmation which occurred in the publication of KGB documents obtained by Alexander Vassiliev in 2011. Proponents of clemency argued that Rosenbergs were actually, quote, innocent Jewish peace activists, end quote. According to American historian Ronald Radosh, the Soviet Union's goal was, quote, to deflect the world's attention from the sordid execution of the innocent in Soviet-controlled Czechoslovakia, end quote. Einstein and Urey plead with President Harry S. Truman to pardon the Rosenbergs. On February 11th, Pope Pius XIII appealed to Eisenhower to spare the couple, but Eisenhower refused. All other appeals were also unsuccessful. The execution was delayed from the scheduled date of June 18th because the Supreme Court Associate Justice William O. Douglas had granted a stay of execution on the previous day. This stay resulted from an intervention in the case by Fike Farmer, a Tennessee lawyer whose efforts had been scorned by Block. The execution was scheduled for 11 p.m. the evening of June 19th during Sabbath, which begins and ends around sunset. Block had asked for more time, filing a complaint that the execution on the Sabbath offended the defendant's Jewish heritage. Rhoda Lex, another attorney on the Rosenberg's defense team, also made this argument before Judge Kaufman. Their strategy failed. Kaufman, who stated his concerns about executing the Rosenbergs on Sabbath, rescheduled the execution for 8 p.m. instead, before sunset on Sabbath, the regular time for executions at Sing Sing, where they were being held. On June 19th, Julius died from the first electric shock. Ethel's execution did not go smoothly. After she was given the normal course of 3 electric shocks, attendants removed the strapping and other equipment only to have doctors determine her heart was still beating. 2 more electrical shocks were applied, and at the conclusion, eyewitnesses reported that smoke rose from her head. The Rosenbergs were the only American civilians executed for espionage during the Cold War. The funeral services were held in Brooklyn on June 21st. The Rosenbergs were buried at Wellwood Cemetery, which is a Jewish cemetery in Pine Lawn, New York. The Times reported that 500 people attended, and some 10,000 stood outside. In 1953, socialist historian W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a poem titled The Rosenbergs, which began, quote, "Crucify us, vengeance of God, as you crucified 2 more Jews," end quote, and ended, quote, "Who has been crowned on yonder stair, red restitution or black despair," end quote. From 1953 to 1964, Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, wrote in his published memoir that he, quote, "he cannot specifically say what kind of help the Rosenbergs provided us," end quote, but he had learned from Joseph Stalin and Molotov that they, quote, "had provided very significant help in accelerating the production of our atomic bomb," end quote. Boris V. Brokovich, the engineer who later became director of Chelyabinsk 40, the plutonium production reactor and acceleration and extraction facility that the Soviet Union used to create its first bomb material, alleged that Khrushchev was a quote-unquote silly fool. He said that the Soviets had developed their own bomb by trial and error. He stated, quote, "You sat the Rosenbergs in the electric chair for nothing. We got nothing from the Rosenbergs," end quote. The Vienna Project was a United States counterintelligence program to decrypt messages transmitted by the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union. Initiated when the Soviet Union was an ally of the United States, the program continued during the Cold War, when it was considered an enemy. The Vienna messages did not feature in the Rosenberg's trial, which relied instead on the testimony from the collaborators, but they heavily informed the U.S. government's overall approach to investigating and prosecuting domestic communists. David Greenglass recanted his testimony about his sister having typed the notes. He said, quote, "I frankly think my wife did the typing, but I don't remember," end quote. He said he gave false testimony to protect himself and his wife, and that he was encouraged by the prosecution to do so. Quote, "My wife is more important to me than my sister, or my mother, or my father, okay? And she was the mother of my children," end quote. He refused to express remorse for his decision to betray his sister. He stated, quote, "I would not sacrifice my wife and my children for my sister," end quote. At the grand jury, Ruth Greenglass was asked, quote, "Didn't you write the information down on a piece of paper?" End quote. She replied, quote, "Yes, I wrote the information down on a piece of paper, and Julius Rosenberg took it with him," end quote. At the trial, she testified that Ethel typed the notes about the atomic bomb. Numerous articles were published in 2008 related to the Rosenberg case. Deputy Attorney General of the United States William P. Rogers, who had been part of the prosecution of the Rosenbergs, discussed the strategy at the time in relation to seeking the death sentence for Ethel. He said that they had urged the death sentence for Ethel in an effort to extract a full confession from Julius. He reportedly said, quote, "She called our bluff," end quote, as she made no effort to push her husband for any action. In September, Warren Sabel was interviewed by the New York Times after the revelations from the grand jury testimony. He admitted that he had given documents to the Soviet contact, but he said those had to be with defense radar and weaponry. He confirmed that Julius Rosenberg was, quote, in a conspiracy that delivered to the Soviets classified military and industrial information on the atomic bomb, end quote, and, quote, Julius never told me about anything else that he was engaged in, end quote. Michael's daughter, Ivy Meeropol, directed a documentary about her grandparents, aired during execution, which was featured at a Sundance Film Festival. Their son's current position is that Julius was legally guilty of the conspiracy charge, although not of atomic spying, while Ethel was only generally aware of his activities. The children say that their father did not deserve the death penalty and that their mother was wrongfully convicted. They continue to campaign for Ethel to be posthumously legally exonerated. In 2009, extensive notes collected from KGB archives were made public in a book published by Yale University Press, Spies, The Rise and Fall of the KGB in America, written by John Earl Haynes, Harvey Keir, and Alexander Vasily. Vasily's notebooks were included KGB comments concerning Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and made clear that the KGB considered Julius Rosenberg an effective agent and Ethel a supporter of his work. According to Vasily, Julius and Ethel worked personally with KGB agents who were given the codenames Tyne and Cassius, and were described as being the ones who recruited Greenglass and McNutt for the Manhattan Project spy mission. Although the public release of Vasily's notebooks did not occur until 2009, the notebooks had been originally intercepted during the Vienna decryptions. In March 2016, Michael and Robert, via the Rosenberg Fund for Children, launched a petition campaign calling on President Barack Obama and U.S. Attorney General Loretta Lynch to formally exonerate Ruth Rosenberg. In October 2016, both Michael and Robert spoke with Anderson Cooper in an interview which aired on 60 Minutes. In January 2017, Senator Elizabeth Warren sent Obama a letter requesting consideration of the exoneration request. In 2021, Ethel's sons restarted the campaign to pardon Ethel, as they were optimistic that President Joe Biden would consider this favorably. Ethel Rosenberg, A Cold War Tragedy by Ann Zeba, was published by Oren Books in 2021. As of June 2023, Michael and Robert were requesting Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines to release the records related to their mother's case, per a 2009 executive order. In 2024, the Meeropols were given a copy of a contemporary handwritten memo by Meredith Gardner, a linguist and codebreaker at what later became NSA, based on Russian decrypts, and claimed that Ethel Rosenberg knew about Julius' espionage work, but that, quote, due to ill health she did not engage in the work herself, end quote.